Hi, Cobheran from Lorelines here. If you've been hiding under a rock, you might have noticed that we've been going through Final Fantasy XIII, which we've been streaming under that same rock. I have a colored history with this game, which I first got when the game released in December of 2009 on Xbox 360. I played the game for a total of 2 hours. I found the characters uninteresting, didn't like only being able to control one character in combat, and did not understand what was going on. I put the game aside and never touched it again. After my negative experiences with Final Fantasy XI and XII, I almost put the series down for good. Between then and now, a small game called Final Fantasy XIV came out, and since 2.0, I've been living in that world. Since I started lore diving into 14 and working on lore lines, there have been a couple of instances where I've grown curious about giving 13 another try.
The 13 trilogy. The 13 trilogy. The 13 trilogy.
I'm not sure what it could have been, but suffice to say that I decided to finally bite the bullet and give the game another try. So let's go into that. Final Fantasy XIII is about a character named Red 13 who, wrong game. Final Fantasy XIII is about a group of people who are all being carted off to hell to die because of Red Scare. The majority of the game takes place on Cocoon, a bastion of freedom hanging out about a mile over the surface of Grand Pulse, a communist super Australia full of nasty monsters and savage people who want nothing more than to kill everyone in Cocoon and destroy their economy. Now, about the point I reached where I'd gotten the first time I played the game, the Vestige, I started to realize the horrible truth about Final Fantasy XIII. The game shamelessly rips off Final Fantasy XIV at every opportunity. We even saw when it happened, when lightning showed up in Eorzea to steal all the game's good ideas. I hadn't originally planned on streaming my playthrough of the game, but then the team started screaming that I needed to be streaming the game because of my constant commentary. The result of this, aside from the barrage of copyright claims from YouTube for having the audacity to actually play this game, is that I got to experience a much better game than I expected. While the game has a storytelling method I don't particularly care for, which is a type of in media res that flashes back occasionally to fill in the gaps and expand on characters, once I had the information, I wasn't as annoyed by it. At first, it reminded me of Lost quite a bit, a show I couldn't stand precisely because of that storytelling method that left me wanting to just cut the show together chronologically and then see how interesting it was after that. And when I first played 13, that's exactly how I felt. Lost. I didn't know the characters, why were they there, or why the game was so determined to make Sazh the comic relief, a perception that I actively found offensive. He would later reveal himself to be one of the most relatable characters in the game. The first time you get to control the true villain of the piece, Vanille, in Anima's Vestige, during Snow's segment, I discovered that Anima was a Garlean. And now, seeing this game through the lens of a Final Fantasy XIV player, I was immediately hooked. I needed to know what else this game had taken from my beloved MMO, and expose it for what it was. An actually decent Final Fantasy game. While Final Fantasy XIV draws a lot of inspiration for story beats and elements from other Final Fantasy games, I'd only really been aware of the models that had been lifted from Final Fantasy XIII to put stuff in front of the player to kill. My perception then was that Final Fantasy XIII didn't really have much to contribute in terms of story or themes to the world that Final Fantasy XIV was trying to tell.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong.
I was wrong. Much like how the game uses Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy XIV uses elements and themes from 13 on a macro level that aren't immediately apparent to someone who hasn't played the game. A person who hasn't played Final Fantasy VI can easily identify Magitech armor from Final Fantasy VI, but might not necessarily be aware that Kalusha uses the same color palette from Final Fantasy VI's World of Ruin. In the same way, 14 uses the aesthetic of the Fal'Cie for the Allegan Empire. The central theme around Final Fantasy XIII is about creating your own destiny in defiance of the fate imposed on humanity by the fal'Cie, up to and including choosing where and how one dies. It's remarkably similar to Garlean propaganda spoken by Gaius in the Praetorium and Varus when speaking to Emet-Selch. The concept of crystal stasis we first see at the end of the Vestige when we meet Sarah was a mind-blowing experience for me. When l'Cie, or humans, are given a fate by fal'Cie to enact their will within a certain time frame, complete their mission, they turn to crystal. It was a revelation that immediately drew a 1-to-1 to G'rahatia at the end of 5.3. Having completed his task on the first, he turned to crystal. Though he had given himself this fate by tying himself to the crystal tower, it gave him a limited amount of time in order to carry out his mission. But more than that, the concept of crystal stasis itself brings to light a core concept in Final Fantasy XIV, which is that of light and dark itself. Pure light being the power of stasis, and pure darkness the power of chaos. While light and dark are nothing new, this was the first game I could draw a direct line to where those concepts had originated. While darkness hasn't yet been gone into in depth in original Final Fantasy XIII, the concept of chaos has been broached several times in the data logs. However, what I have yet to see appear in 14 is the concept of Seath, or those who were unable to or completely defied completing their fates. The power of the fal'Cie tore their souls apart, resulting in twisted, mindless aberrations. Though it does somewhat remind me of Sin Eaters in Shadowbringers, though mechanically different. I thought it was clever of Final Fantasy XIII to take Igyorm's design for lightning, but I realized as I played through the game and met Daisley that there was yet another connection to 14. The Final Fantasy series is no stranger to evil religions, Final Fantasy X probably being the most well-known example with Yevon. But the supposed cult-like reverence for the leader of Sanctum is very reminiscent of the Ishgardian Church, protecting the city from evil dragons that lurk to the north. The pairing of Lightning and Daisley was oddly reminiscent of Igyorm and Thordan, which is when I realized, why had they used Igyorm specifically? She was originally intended to be a foil for Azael, but they could have used Pasturat, or Dudalafon, or Ultima, or any of the other Ascians and given them her backstory. The only reason I can think of that it was her specifically was their connection to 13 and Final Fantasy 13. And then I got to the Burn. It was called the Ashen Sands in 13, but it was the Burn, a colorless place of stasis devoid of any significant life. Apparently, when Vanille led the attack from Super Australia on Cocoon, or rather failed to and forced Fang to do it, the resulting wound bled crystal on the land below. The crystal, much like mentioned in the Light and Dark video covered, follows the law of thermodynamics, in that by being perfect order, the crystal represents the complete absence of chaos or entropy. Unable to grow or change, nothing can exist, and everything died. In Final Fantasy XIV, we see the same effect when the land is flooded by light ether. Near the end of the game, Cocoon is falling towards Grand Pulse in Dalamud-like fashion, when in an absolute flame of truth's moment, the falling moon is stopped in its tracks, saving both worlds in the process. It's a shame that Louisoix didn't have a pair of... what the fuck? As for my impressions of the game itself, I understand the criticisms. I shared them myself once. But after getting lost so many times in straight hallway maps that are not hallways at all, growing to like the characters, and finding myself enjoying the combat system, I can't agree with them anymore. Much like Final Fantasy XIV, the combat system in 13 needs to be fully unlocked before it gets good. Once I reached that point, I found it to be clever and, dare I say, fun. Like Final Fantasy IV, 13 uses ATB combat that doesn't wait around for you to input commands for the monsters to try and eat you, which adds a good kind of stress and requires planning and knowledge of your party's strengths and weaknesses. Meanwhile, Lightning and Hope turned out to be my two favorite characters. Both characters start and end in very different places. They both grow and develop in good ways. The other characters, while they learn about themselves, don't really change much over the course of the game. Snow doesn't become more cautious, Saz doesn't become more reckless, and Fang generally remains unchanged throughout the course of the game. Hope was an unexpected bright spot for the game, not only for his absolutely broken magic stat, which made many encounters a laughable walk in the park, but for his outlook and surprising bloodlust. He starts the game scared, not wanting to fight, and generally annoying. From there, he grows into what I would only describe as a true Final Fantasy XIV white mage, filled with salt and anger and the desire to mitigate damage through the elimination of the enemy. And Final Fantasy XIII exemplifies what I've always suspected about white mages. They don't heal you to keep you alive out of the goodness of their hearts. These black-hearted healers heal you, so you can't die while you suffer. As for Vanille being the villain, she does nothing but lie for 75% of the game. Everything bad that happens to all the characters is directly related to actions she takes, which she lies about, and then actively encourages party members to place themselves in life-threatening danger with a smile on her face. When Hecaton comes to call her on her bullshit, this pathological liar of a girl goes and blames and manipulates everyone else into doing things for her. I was so happy when Hope eventually called her on her bullshit, and I don't think she ever spoke to him directly again after that. To the very end, I found nothing redeeming about her character, and found it ironic that she'd be the only one to wield death, the ability to eradicate life on a whim, and sabotage the lives of everyone she meets, Fang included. The population of Bodom, those killed during the War of Transgression, the people of Urba, and the main cast all had their lives destroyed because of her. While the Fal'Cie are antagonists, I don't believe they possessed true free will. They were slaves to their focus, which is why they needed human l'Cie. While their actions may seem evil and wrong, they're acting in accordance with what they were created to do. They're tools. So while we defeat Barthandelus and Orphan, I can't honestly say that I held any animosity towards them for what they did. They had no choice. Meanwhile, Vanille did. So while it was annoying to suffer her presence on the party, it was extremely satisfying to see her end up in Crystal Jail where she belongs. It's just a shame she had to take Fang with her.
You are cold-blooded. Lying so people would trust you. Using them as shields. How many you gotta drag down with you?
I'm
a coward and a killer. The people you use don't get to live. Why should you? Tired of living with guilt? Then die with it. Vanille.
My name is Herbadia Vanille. I'm a l'Cie from Grand Pulse. And to everyone on Cocoon, evil.